Okay, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this important event to mark the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, or more commonly known as the IDAHOTB. My name is Chong. I'm the Director General of the Sustainable Development Department in the Asian Development Bank. I can't believe it's been already 1 year since we celebrated this event a year ago on the 17th of May, 2019. And as you would all agree that lots of things happened in the last 1 year. And this year we've put in a lot of work, this time working with our other development partners to organize the series of trio of events to celebrate this week. And in this regard, I would like to thank the colleagues from the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the Inter-American Development Bank for partnering with the Asian Development Bank to work on this important event. So year 2020 is a very, very memorable one. I hope we can look back and smile at what happened this year. And it's been a very interesting, to say the least. And all of us are in the middle of COVID-19 pandemic lockdown to, of course, varying degrees. But no matter who you are, no matter where you are, we're all adjusting the way we live, and it's extremely inconvenient, I can imagine. But unfortunately, there are segments of our society which are experiencing a bit more severe challenges than everybody else. And some segments of the LGBTI community are facing particular challenge during the lockdowns in cases where family and social support systems are not adequate due to stigma associated with the sexual or gender identity. So on Monday this week, the World Bank hosted the first of the 3 events. And at this event, the panelists discussed the indicative evidence of the LGBTI people have been particularly affected by the pandemic and policy responses. And first, the disproportionate prevalence of LGBTI people in the bottom 40% of the household income creates an additional overall burden. Second, the effect on the closing of the non-COVID related health services, such as the HIV/AIDS, has an effect on LGBTI community. So as we all know, the Asian Development Bank is about developing our region and reducing poverty and making sure that we don't leave anyone behind. So in ADB's latest long-term strategy 2030, it makes a very specific prioritization to ensure that the investment that we make address persistent poverty that still remain in our region. So in order to do this, we need reliable data, meaningful data, which is essential if we are to meet the challenge of poverty reduction and removing marginalization. So marginalization takes different forms, which is why an understanding of the situations of various groups, such as the indigenous peoples, the disabled, the elderly, the old, the young people, and the LGBTI community and population are all essential. Only by enhancing our knowledge and basing our actions on data and evidence, we will then be able to design and implement our responses to address the potentially marginalized people's needs. So let me now start by introducing the panel of experts. They will be providing their insights on the data gap related to LGBTI. So our panelists are in the order of speaking. First is Timur Ojanen, who is the sexual and gender minorities, mental health, sexuality education expert at the Faculty of Learning Science and Education at Thammasat University, Thailand. He will talk about his direct experience of collecting data on sexual orientation and gender identity issues in Thailand, including the intersection with socioeconomic status and the lessons learned from this. Then he will be followed by Sarita K.C., who is a leader of the LGBTI civil society in Nepal, especially promoting the needs of lesbians and bisexual and trans women. She has worked extensively with the government of Nepal on their unique categorization of LGBTI people in their census, and will discuss this along with the specific issues facing LGBT women. She'll be followed by Ramil Andag, who is from the NGO APCOM, which works for the rights of sexual and gender minorities in over 30 countries in Asia and the Pacific region. She has been overseeing some interesting qualitative research in several countries in the Southeast Asian region, and we'll talk about what we can learn to increase our understanding of sexual and gender minorities in different contexts. And finally, last but not the least, we have Chiu Tung Shen, who is assistant professor of the Gender Studies program and founding director of the Sexualities Research Program at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He will talk about the challenges with the categorization of the Asian context and his experiences with fostering inclusion in the private sector. So with this, let me hand over the platform to Timo, and then he will go straight to Sarita, then Ramil and Tung. And I would like to request each speaker to limit their intervention to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this webinar. I would like to share a little bit about 4 studies in which I've been involved over the past decade here in Thailand or so. The latest of these studies was the World Bank study on the economic inclusion LGBTI groups, which was done a couple of years ago. And I think that study was, to my knowledge, the first study in Thailand that obtained a quantitative sample of over 1,000 LGBTI participants in Thailand. That study gave a clear quantitative indication that discrimination is really quite widespread in many sectors, including education, employment, government services, financial services, and so on. Our role at the Faculty of Learning Sciences and Education at Thammasat University was helping with the survey design and the qualitative component, which consisted of live course interviews. We did this with 19 people. And these interviews helped us to see a little bit about the intersectional issues. For example, we noticed that middle-class people were finding it particularly difficult to manage the expectations of their workplaces, because many of these workplaces, especially on the public sector, have very strict expectations for propriety. And often these expectations mean that you have to behave in a way which matches your person. But this is very difficult for transgender people. Whereas in working class workplaces, sometimes in Thailand, the expectations are not so strict. It's not such a big deal how you express yourself. But on the other hand, if you're working class, you may not have the option of establishing your own business, which would give you the chance to circumvent discrimination in the workplace altogether. So these are just some of the examples of intersectional issues. Now, as for the quantitative part of that study, although it was groundbreaking, I think it also had the major limitation of having a convenient sample. And I think that's always going to be the case when you do studies where you try to get an LGBTI specific sample. I'm not aware of any sampling methods that could be used to get a representative sample of LGBTI population. Therefore, I think the other studies which we did in the past show their strength, because in all of those we studied youth. And when we studied youth who were in schools, we were able to do cluster sampling. In other words, first choose randomly the provinces that we would study, and then in those choose randomly schools that we would study, and in those schools then the classrooms that we would study. And we simply had a couple of questions about LGBTI status. But in the main question that we used, we had roughly 13 response options and yet other category. And we got responses in all of those, including the other category. And we found from those studies that 11 to 15% of Thai youth identify with LGBTI categories. 11 to 15%, that's a lot. And it's also in big contrast to the 2006 National Sexual Behavior Survey of the general population of adults, where just 1 to 2% identified as same-sex attracted. The difference, I think, can be explained by the difference in the data collection method, where the National Behavior Survey, they went to people's doors and asked to interview them. Now, if a stranger comes up to your door and asks you to talk about your sexual orientation, it can be quite intimidating. Whereas in our studies, we used a self-administered questionnaire, which they were able to complete with full privacy. So I think privacy of data collection is really important. Having the right response options that people can relate to, and also the kind of sampling. That said, I'm very much in favor of including these kinds of questions in national census and the related studies. I think those are really the only way to get representative data from adult LGBT population. But it will be really important to use the kind of sampling, firstly, well, that they can do well, but also the kinds of response options that people can understand, and the kind of data collection method that will give people the privacy to answer those questions with full confidence that it will be used against them. I think one way to do this is simply bring them a tablet where they can answer those questions by themselves. And I think that's all from me, and looking forward to what the next panelists will have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to have this opportunity to share my experience. This year's theme, Break the Silence, lies at the very core of the rights of gender and sexual minorities in Nepal and everywhere in the world. The fact that we are still talking about breaking the silence is an evidence of how far we have to go so that people can feel comfortable to share their feelings, tell their near and dear ones who they are, love and be loved for their identity. We should make sure that everyone is given equal space, equal opportunity, and is treated with respect and dignity. And in this conversation, gender and sexual minorities should not be left behind. No one should be left behind. It is important that we realize that breaking the silence should not be the sole responsibility of the ones who are already being shunned, ostracized, and discriminated by our society. It is our responsibility to break this silence, to have our values and values heard and respected, the values that treat everyone with respect. This is fact that we don't have authentic data of LGBTIQ people. 2011 census was adopted, the census method to collect the details of population of the third gender for the first time in Nepal in 100 years long history of population census. However, the census produced a low number of sexual and gender minorities. For the 2021 census, the Central Bureau of Statistics has made some major changes in the 2011 census questions on the choice of sex. It includes the option of other sexual and gender in the place of third sex that was among the option in the 2011 census question. We are worried that the result may not reflect the real number of LGBTIQ due to confusion in identification problem or stigma, but if development partners, civil society, and others shows their solidarity to raise awareness in the run-up to the census. This move will allow LGBTI people to have authentic data, planning for benefit for the social schemes, including other rights, government quotas guaranteed to the LGBTI people in the Constitution, which was passed in 2015. The discrimination and the violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity is extensive, as the misguided perception of gender and sexual orientation are only confined to heterogeneity. Most of the LGBTQ are often subjected to the police harassment, extortion, unreported and arbitrary detention, and also suffering from domestic violence, wrong tradition, and cultural malpractices. Some awful examples of violence are sex-corrective treatment, forceful marriage to opposite sex, rape to correct the identity, sexual violence, sexual harassment, suicide, and killings. They are still accused in the name of sin. Several research and survey in Nepal have reported that LGBTQ people have tolerated verbal abuse, emotional abuse, and physical abuse from perpetrators who were close family members. LGBTQ people in Nepal are witnessing changes through development initiatives, social security, affirmative actions, participation, income generation, decision making, access to policy making, and enjoy other human rights is still out of reach. One of the biggest leap forward for the LGBTQ movement was when the World Health Organization was able to cancel this notion that homosexuality is a mental health disease in 1990, May 17. Ensuring legal rights is only half of the battle, and the other half is ensuring that members of gender and sexual minorities are given the support and resources to participate in every aspect of society. It is time for us to realize the amount of pain we are causing and suffering. It is time to talk about the issues, find ways to end the discrimination, and celebrate inclusiveness and diversity. At the end of the day, we are all the same. We all want to live our lives to our potential. We want to be heard and appreciated, and we want all to be who we are and love who we love. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having us on this platform where we can share our experiences, learnings, and insights on data generation in relation to LGBTQI research and outcomes work in general, where we aim to contribute for more LGBTQI inclusion. APCOM is a Bangkok-based non-government organization, and we were founded in 2007 and work around the areas of health and human rights of SOGI, diverse SOGI SC people and communities, and health of men who have sex with men and gay men. And we're presently implementing a project which is supported by Voice Global, where we were able to do pilot researches in Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, PDR, and the Philippines, where we looked into the experiences of inclusion, exclusion, and experiences of discrimination of LGBTQI communities. However, I would want also to say that, of course, as pilot researches, and we use focus group discussions, there are inherent limitations, like we were only able to conduct 3 focus group discussions in each country, even as we tried to reach representations from lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgender, and intersex individuals. We also had some difficulties in terms of reaching some sectors of LGBTQI, because I think this also has something to do with how people identify and the level of discourse ongoing on sexual orientation, gender identities, and expressions and sex characteristics. So some of the main research findings which we have is there's still experiences of discrimination and exclusion in the areas of health, work, education, and access to financial services based on a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. And in the Philippines, for example, the basis for this discrimination and exclusion would be actual and perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. So you don't have to identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, or transgender. But if people perceive you to be one, you will be experiencing this can be a basis for exclusion. The general policy and legislative environment, there are no laws which would criminalize being LGBTQI. There are still no laws which would protect and include LGBTQI people. In fact, there are local policies which are being implemented, which negatively affects LGBTQI population. And also, it was surfaced that programs and practices are still heteronormative and are not inclusive of LGBTQI. And while LGBTQI people experience exclusion in the areas which were looked into, like health, education, work, and financial services, the experiences of discrimination and exclusion would be experienced differently by a lesbian person, by a gay individual, by a trans woman, by a trans man, and intersex. So a person's sex, a person's identity and expression would be some of the basis for experiences of inclusion. For example, in the areas of education specifically, there are still different degrees and experiences of exclusion, like and discrimination, verbal and physical abuse, being called names, and some school policies which are not inclusive. And in some instances, there are educational institutions whose policies are expressly prohibit being associated with LGBTQI communities. And all this affect educational attainment and achievement of learners. Specific to work, SOGI discrimination and exclusion based on a person's sexual orientation, gender identities, expression, and characteristics are being experienced in relation to 1, finding jobs, 2, maintaining jobs and promotions. So trans men and trans women and those who are expressing themselves outside of the binary usually experience this in the interview stage. And in the workplace, there are still heteronormative standards and policies and expectations. This would include uniform policies, LGBTQI, a self-identifying LGBTQI worker who will be expected to marry sometime. And then there are issues of unsafe workspaces, harassment, bullying, and feeling of unsafety and insecurity in using gendered facilities and spaces. And these experiences affects productivity. And in terms of health, also it was surfaced that there are still experiences of discrimination because health programs generally are still heteronormatively structured. So how does APCOM and our partner organizations analyze this? That we look at this as an experience of discrimination and exclusion in one aspect of our life. For example, challenges and limitations in accessing educational services would affect our future employment prospects. It would affect our ability to save, for example. It will affect whether or not we are able to provide for ourselves and for our families. How do we look at this in terms of and what did the experience bring us? We would like to highlight that for institutions who are reflecting on LGBTQI inclusion, we would like to highlight that institutions should work closely and meaningfully involve the LGBTQI organizations and communities. These involvements should be in form of consultations, involvement not only as, if we are talking of data generation and knowledge building, not only as data sources, but as experts ourselves in our lived experiences. We should be involved in the planning, in the design, implementation, and analysis, because it's our lives which we are talking about. I would like also to emphasize the need for partnering with LGBTQI organizations, because it is critical to reaching populations which may be left behind and who have specific vulnerabilities. Partnering with LGBTQI organization in data generation would mean that we are able to provide safe spaces for LGBTQI individuals to talk about their experiences and for our narratives and stories to be told. Another thing which we can look into is awareness raising and learning sessions about LGBTQI, because only when we increase also the discussions around the issues can we proceed with inclusion in the levels of processes, programs, policies, spaces, and activities. Data and recognizing the data gaps moving forward. We can use this data as evidence for our advocacies for more LGBTQI inclusions. Inclusion not only in terms of data generation, but on a larger scale, programs, policies, practices, and spaces. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And I want to thank ADB again for inviting me to join the panel. I feel really inspired to join the other panelists and also to address such a topic. I want to first start by telling you a little bit about where I'm coming from. I'm trained as a sociologist. For me, empirical evidence is extremely important for any kind of policy making and any kind of presenting an argument in a way. So actually, I see myself as a scholar activist who is very keen on getting more LGBTI data and research out there. But by getting the research and data, we're not only talking about that we get another pile of research that would be that would stay in the library and would not get up. For me, I'm extremely passionate about generating data and research that can be used in the real world. I think I'm still a very naive person and a very naive academic who believes that when there is, we can change the world for better. And you that it is particularly do so when we want to work on LGBTQI plus issues in the Asian context. Because as all of us know that to talk about LGBTQI plus issues in context, we can very easily run into arguments that based on personal viewpoints, generally related. Different viewpoints to governments or organizations may have quite on plus issues, but would like to convince you that actually with more data and research, we can sometimes change our dialogue a little bit. And in my experience, doing research in Hong Kong and also mainland China and also some limited experience and with research, we can sometimes change the dialogue a little bit. Say, when talk to business organizations, we may be able to convince them that actually when LGBTQ is discriminated or negatively treated at a workplace, then they would be more likely to think about leaving the organization, or they may feel less belonging to an organization. Them feel, well, actually, it's not so much a moral issue or a cultural issue, but it is a business issue. It's a issue. And then also, likewise, when we talk to the government, sometimes there may be different viewpoints that they would generalize. Oh, a certain culture is conservative, plus issues, just like sometimes in Hong Kong we run into argument. Research with public attitudes towards LGBTQI plus issues, we found that 91.8% of the general who are aged 18 to 24 actually support legislation against discrimination. So I would like to argue that by more data actually change the dialogue in the region, sometimes that is laden with cultural arguments or morality communities, there always come challenges, and I would like to highlight two of them here because of the limited time. I think the first challenge, Timo Robert, is the diversity population that we so far today, and also in the topic we have talked about LGBT people. But there is also a lot of anthropological and historical debate about definitions and wordings in terms of how gender and sexual diverse people in the region like to identify ourselves. And I think the other challenge is also we mustn't forget actually all over the world, including in the region. Still, there are societies and communities that may not be LGBTQI friendly. Issues around sensitivity, how to make communities feel that the data collected would be beneficial to them is of crucial importance. I remember in a conference that I co-organized with the UNDP Hong Kong back in 2018, a lot of the community groups that we engaged were very concerned about data collection in terms of anonymity, confidentiality, and how such research not doing harm. We must remember for a lot of community members that institutions may not have always been on their side, but instead data sometimes can make them feel that they're being exposed or they're being threatened. And so I think a lot of those issues are extremely important. So I can't agree more with what the previous speakers talk about, the importance of community engagement. And in fact, I would argue that data collection should be a concerted and orchestrated effort that should be owned and by everyone in the process, be it a development partner, be it academics, community members. And I would really encourage everyone to think about starting that partnership as early as possible so that everyone is really takes an active part in that process. And I would also on interesting note, say that I think we should not let perfect get in the way of good. Data collection is not an easy process. As someone who has dedicated my academic career on, to be quite honest to even say on it, I've also experienced negative even in my own career by taking on a topic. But you have to that of course in the most perfect world we would like to see. But I think that in many parts of the world, for the time being, unfortunately, not be able to be seen in the short term, and so I would really love to encourage everyone to think about slow in your work and how you can work sector to do it together. For me, I'm really passionate about thinking how we have the data and the research, how we can create social change together. Especially as I think everyone have been some of the most members of society, and when we have more so an overall picture, to let more stakeholders know the concerns and the community. And as the saying goes, that if one is not counted, doesn't count. I'm really passionate about how we can use data and research to drive. And I look to the question and answer.
So anyway, thank you very much for all your insightful remarks. And now we would like to get a bit more detail on some of the things that you've discussed. And afterwards, I would like to open up for question and answers from the greater audience. So please do send your messages in through the live stream function. So while you type your questions in, let me pose some questions to each of the panel members so far. So let me start with Timo. So in terms of any kind of data, the collection probably is the most challenging thing because you need to correct data. And what are some of the methods that you think you used or you think would work well in a situation where you have to overcome the barriers such as stigma and anonymity? And how do you see any policy response in Thailand to do more complete data as it emerges. So let me start with Timo.
Okay. Well, one of the things that in our experience has worked well is self-administered questionnaires. So in our experience, because we were working with school kids, we would simply bring them a laptop and our computerized questionnaire was on the laptop. So on one hand, we could see who was taking the questionnaire. We could see that no teacher was looking over their shoulder while they were responding to the survey. And so we could be reasonably confident that we got the data from the people we wanted to, and they could provide it privately. So that worked quite well. For the qualitative side, I think the life story interviews we did also worked quite well. We could see how these issues accumulated over the life course and had an effect sometimes much longer. Like, for example, if you're a trans woman who is discriminated against already in school or at university, that might also have a bearing on their opportunities later on when they're looking for jobs. As for policy response, I think Thai government agencies have always had some engagement with the studies after we published our results, but sometimes it could have been more systematic. I have one example, which I think was a good example of a positive response, and that was in response to a curriculum and textbook review by Foundation of SOGI Rights and Justice. That review found that the existing health education textbooks were quite stigmatizing at the time regarding LGBT issues. And already at that time, there was the data from the review and there was the Gender Equality Act of 2015. So it was possible to make a complaint and present the case that here we have these textbooks, they are discriminatory and they're based on a discriminatory curriculum. So a complaint was made under the adjudication committee of that law, and they decided that the ministry actually had to change the curriculum and the textbooks based on that. And that's been done now. So that's one example of a positive change that required both data and a legal framework.
So let me pose the next question to Sarita. So you've talked about the challenges facing the LGBT women in Nepal, and despite your government's being quite supportive and proactive in terms of supporting the LGBTI community, some LGBT women cannot still face significant discrimination and even some violence. So could you give us some insights on into how other factors such as caste intersect when it comes to discrimination and violence in this context?
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions. Yeah, since Nepal is the most progressive country regarding the LGBTI issues, and I have to talk about that. Being a woman is a second-class citizen, second-class citizen in my country, and we can imagine how difficult for those women who are from sexual and gender minorities, and also we can even imagine how difficult if she is from the Dalit community and if she is from she is from village who don't have any access. So these are the things, these are the things that I have to share. And also there are many LGBTQ women from far western of Nepal and Tarai region are not able to disclose their identity because of the geographic structure and patriarchy norms and values. Many civil society organizations are working on different issues of women, but the issues of LGBTQ women are still not included in mainstream. So recent example, I'd like to emphasize that Nepal government has submitted a national report on Beijing Plus 25, where every women's issues are included, and we even can't see the issues of the LGBTQ women on that report, and we call that a national report. So this is how we LGBTQ women are treated in Nepal. And although the Constitution 2015 provides equal rights to women, the negative stereotype exists due to lack of understanding and awareness on sexual orientation and gender identity at all levels, including the grassroots level. So we have the new drafted Civil Code and Criminal Code of Nepal needs to be revised so that discriminatory laws and practices against LGBTIQ community can be amended. So the LGBTQ people still today in 2019 doesn't have any access to adopting children, and that keeps them for having continuity in their family. So adoption law in Nepal has been built around this gender couple, and only they can adopt children in Nepal. A same-sex relationship has been recognized, but marriage equality is not yet recognized, legalized. The definition of marriage is only between a man and a woman in civil codes should be revised. However, the Constitution right to equality guaranteed that all citizens shall be equal before law. No people shall be denied the equal protection of law. So these are the situation, and also there is still a lack of accountability around the rights to own ancestral property because of their sexual orientation and gender identity for LGBTQ individual, and also there is lack of partners' property right claim. All of this denial to right have seized to the right to dignified life for LGBTQ individual. The separation categorization of LGBTQ communities in the census and citizenship certificate is not enough. The government need to be more accountable to implement it, and independent agencies need to be formulated to make sure what the Constitution say is protected. One of the lesbians shared that her father denied her citizenship because of her sexual orientation, and her father was able to influence the local office too. So this is the situation, and there are still cases of LGBTQ people being discriminated in the job market because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. Urban and rural areas in Nepal are still not ready to accept the concept of LGBTQ. Discrimination happens because of because of the lack of awareness on sexual diversity and weak laws. There is still lack of assigned seat for LGBTQ identified people in public spaces like bus and other public transportation. There are still cases of LGBTQ people being harassed in public spaces, which leads to hate crimes against LGBTQ communities. There is still a lack of visibility and political education around LGBTQ community that leads to sexual, physical, and other forms of violence inside their own families. There are still many cases of LGBTQ people being bullied in school and being expelled because of them not catering to gender norms and for dressing inappropriately. Besides that, lack of human resource on health makes it difficult for LGBTQ to have access to quality health service. We need to train our health professional that when Hippocratic oath says do no harm, it also means any mental, psychological harm or harm to self-esteem. Members of gender and sexual minorities should not have to fear seeking health service or education. The access and representation of LGBTQ individuals in the decision-making position is not accounted for. The affirmation action is not ensured for the LGBT community for the Public Service Commission and in any other position at the government level. Also, regarding the political participation, it is difficult to get the quota in the position within the different political committees. During the election, either one of the first past the post or on the proportionate representation. The quotas for people from LGBTQ community is not specified. Lastly, together we need to make sure that we take complete deliberate steps in the right direction. It is our responsibility to make sure that the society and world should raise the voice against discrimination and violence against to the gender identity expression or sexual orientation. LGBT women are women. We exist and we have rights of freedom of expression. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me pose the next question to Ramil. Your organization, APCOM, has been collecting testimonies on situations faced by LGBTI people during this pandemic. And these testimonies are very powerful in terms of getting to the bottom of the current situation. So based on your all these testimonies, could you give us some insights on what you gained from these, and what are some of the common denominators or common threads that cut across various testimonies, and what are some of the fundamental things that we can do about it?
Thank you very much. Yes, APCOM has been collecting the onset of COVID-19 pandemic. APCOM has collected data from our partner organizations on how the pandemic is affecting their communities and their organizations. So, and I think that COVID-19 would also emphasize the need for more inclusive data gathering, because absence in data might result also in leaving some populations behind in terms of response. So what did we get from the surveys? First, because the data which were being generated generally were for across the population, which makes sense also, but we wanted to look into how will COVID specifically affect populations and communities who are already experiencing discrimination, even during quote-unquote normal times. So what we saw was closure of establishments where LGBTQI people usually works affected employment, job security, and personal security of LGBTQI individuals. And these are the service industries, which were the first to close. Service and entertainment industries, which were the first to close. Considering that there are already challenges and limitations in accessing employment in normal times. COVID-19 responses of governments affect access to health services, including access to HIV and AIDS related services, because the health systems might have been overwhelmed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So there were challenges in terms of accessing HIV related services. Mental health services, which even during normal times are not LGBTQI friendly, so this became more challenging in terms of accessing during the pandemic. Support from families is not possible, especially for LGBTQI individuals whose relationship with their families are strained due to their sexual orientation, gender identities, expression, and characteristics. And in instances where LGBTQI individuals whose relationship with their families have to stay in lockdown with families, this kind of presents exacerbates the experience. And also there have been reports and instances where COVID-19 has been blamed on LGBTQI people. Responses have been based on generally heteronormative and the conception of families as the traditional heteronormative families excludes inclusion of LGBTQI people in terms of response. So what insight in terms of policy do we have? How do we make our responses more inclusive? How do we integrate into our analysis and response how pandemics affect vulnerable sectors and the possible intersections and additional vulnerabilities that are brought about by crisis situations? How do we really leave no one behind?
Oh, thank you very much, Ramil. So let me go to the final panelist, Chong. So you've talked about your work related to the private sector, and I do believe the private sector has also made quite a strong progress in enhancing diversity. But how can the smaller organizations, the small and medium enterprise and informal enterprises, which don't really have such huge budget for these kind of things, unlike the major corporations, how can they incorporate some of the lessons learned and encourage diversity in their organization?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that is a really important question. Actually, is something that's very much on my mind and many others' mind in Hong Kong and also many other places. I think when it comes to engaging the private sector, sometimes it feels like the multinational corporations are more engaged. But I should also add that actually for them, it was quite a journey. As well. I remember that it took me a very long time to build a working relationship with them, and it really took quite a while to see change from being worried as someone who is seen as LGBT plus inclusive to being worried to be seen as someone who is not LGBTI plus inclusive. I think it was for me that was quite an interesting change. In the past, they would be quite worried to see I am someone who is issues. How would people in the industry, general public, do nowadays? Oh, how can we do something? Everyone in our something. And for me, that even for multinational corporate, long time. So, and then it's also very interesting to see how sometimes the dynamics business sector in terms competition and worried about like that somehow actually more inclusive in one way. Yes, I very much agree that SMEs or local businesses is something that we have to think about. In Hong Kong, for example, we see more Chinese-speaking businesses may be less interested to engage. So say that change of mindset rather than because as I always share with the businesses, it's true that diversity and inclusion sometimes would have resources and a budget that is linked to it. It's true that if we provide same-sex partners, it's true that there would be a resource tagged to it. Drive the issue. Important that they, but more important, how everyone is organization that it sometimes may be as simple as the things that they use to address each other. It may be more of a picture of understanding and empathy to each other about respecting differences. So it's true that it has
know about the changes.
But on the other hand, that being not on a higher budget or not having as many resources, no SME in or thinking about respecting the culture and also that has to do more with raising and the management set the tone rather than only putting the dollars. Agree that like the very long road to engage different organizations. Something that we need to work on together on that.
Okay, thank you very much for the panel members for your initial responses to the questions. So let me now turn over to Oliver, who can lead the discussion with the other audience out there who are sending questions. Oliver.
Thanks very much, Wu Chong, and thank you to all the panelists. There've been quite a few questions flooding in, so I've tried to sort of group them and think about some of the key points that people are putting across. One person is making a suggestion about how we could collect data sort of comprehensively on a global basis so that it's comparable, suggesting that you really need to break it down into three, one being gender at birth, the other being gender identity, and the third being sexual orientation. That's the sort of thing that could be collected in censuses and at scale. And just to throw in another question now, because we obviously won't have too much time for too many rounds. Another person is asking about how do we collect data in more sort of legally hostile environments where governments aren't really willing to necessarily recognize LGBT people, or there may even be some form of persecution. Yeah, if you could choose to answer one or other of those questions based on your experience. So should we go around in the same order, starting with Timo?
Okay. I would like to take up the question on censuses, since that's something I feel quite keen about. So I think, yes, those three questions are critical, but it's also difficult to ask those questions in a way that the general public will understand. Because if I think about most people in Thailand, they wouldn't know what gender identity means, or what sexual orientation means, or even what some of the response options mean. So if you do give these kinds of response options, I think you will need to give clarification after each technical term, so that the general public would actually understand them, whichever age they are. Because remember, censuses, we have people who are 100 years old may be answering sometimes. So we can't expect that anyone knows the terms that we find quite commonplace.
As already our early speakers, share that the sexual and gender minorities is really difficult. Talking about the are you listening? Okay. So talking about the Nepal context that people understand as a third gender for LGBTI community. So on this situation that on 2021 there will be a census, and it is because we have to let people know about the sexual and gender minorities while they are understanding LGBTI community as a third gender. So it is challenging for us to let them introduce about life. So on this census also we are trying to use this word so that people could understand about the sexual and gender minorities.
On the points raised, I think on data gathering, I would go back to my point earlier where data gathering should be coupled with awareness raising. Only when there is enough discussion and discourse, no, not only when, but I think discussions and discourse, improved discussions and discourse around sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics, and expressions, it will really contribute to a better data generation. On the second point on hostile environments, the safety and security of LGBTQI community should be paramount. Going back also to my earlier point, we should work with organizations who are based in those contexts where the legal and policy environment may not be that friendly, because they would have the expertise on how to navigate this, as this is experienced by them. What is their analysis of the situation? How can we move forward? And also for regional organizations and institutions to advocate for more inclusive policies. And of course, considering also limitations. But that's how I would like, that's how I look at these things right now.
Yeah, thank you very much for the two questions that I think they're also very much interrelated as well. I think given that I have worked in some environments like mainland China or another project, actually also research on LGBTI people's lives in post-time legal and policy environments. These are issues that I think that sometimes when I make manuscript non-representative sample journals, then they would ask, oh, why can't you representative census in China? If I were to wait for that to happen, have a much to see that. So sometimes I feel that it's a matter of like what we can do in certain situations that may not be as friendly environment for the LGBTQI plus community. And I feel that like we should aim for census representative data, but at the meantime, try to collect what we do. And I really want to echo the other panel members about how to involve the community, and also how to explain to the community why we are collecting the data, how they're going to be stored, how they're going to be used, how they're going to be handled, perhaps after period, after the data is being collected. Make sure that they're being all of that. So in my experiences of trying to collect data with motive to take part more, be so much be the incentive that we give them in terms of coupon or monitoring to ensure that, well, actually, topic that clearly matters to you. Voices have been asked. We really want to hear your voices. I think it's really purposes, but also I think that difficult sometimes for community to retell different experiences. I want to echo Ramo's point about community engagement, that we can also think about more to engage the communities, perhaps not only as respondents, but also as well. Also, there's a knowledge about the community, perhaps do more work on training community members, sometimes also as a way of giving job opportunity to community as well. Issues around that we have to handle carefully.
Thanks very much to all the panelists. We haven't got too much longer, so I'm just going to read out one comment I got in from one of our colleagues here at ADB, and then I just have a question just on Nepal, actually, for you, Sarita, just a brief one, because I don't think we have time for another round of answers. So this is from my colleague Francesco Tonieri in our South Asia department. He says, that consultations, sorry, I lost where he started his quote now. The South Asia department, since last year's IDAHOTB, is finalising a range of internal country-specific social exclusion profiles, taking stock of social exclusionary practices in South Asia on a range of categories, which include sexual and gender identities. Consultations with the LGBTIQ community in late 2019 and early 2020 have been highly informative. We are working with the main knowledge department in the bank to further engage in the broader area of social inclusion, and we remain committed to operationalize the findings as feasible within our operation. So that's just a nice little quote from one of our colleagues on some of the work that's actually happening already at ADB. And I think we have a few minutes left, and Wu Chong is just going to say a few final words. So just quickly before that, Sarita, one of the questions came in, and I think it's really worth covering, where they just hadn't quite understood, and I think it will be useful for you to clarify how the terminology in the census is changing from the census in 2011 to the census in 2021, because I think that's very interesting, and that could potentially sort of really pave the way for future data collection on that kind of a level.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Yes, on 2011, there was third gender, and when the LGBTI movement started and when the government recognized LGBTI community as a third gender. So in that context, we recognize on 2011 as a third gender and household listing that there was male, female, and third gender. So on 2021, so we are on 2015 that we adopt a new constitution where our rights are recognized on the constitution. So where the LGBTI community are mentioned as a sexual and gender minorities on the constitution. So on this census, we are, using using that word sexual and gender minorities. So on 2021, there will be the change on third gender as sexual and gender community or minorities. So this is the changes that we have been, having advocacy with the Central Bureau of Statistics, and this will be the change on 2021 census because, we are sexual and gender minorities, and which already our constitution has adapted as a sexual and gender minorities. And since we have been practicing this word in the daily basis in different banks and different offices and different legal documents that we are using sexual and gender minorities, and then why not on census also? So yeah, this is the thing that we have been that we have been doing advocacy to change this word on that census.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sarita. And I think, to finish, that really emphasizes the key importance of language in data collection in this area. And that's been a point that's been very well made by all the panelists. So I'll hand finally back to Chong to finish the event.
So yeah, again, thank you very much for the great panel, for your enthusiastic participation and incredible insights. And also all the participants who attended this webinar from both within the ADB and outside. It's been a fabulous discussion. The panel members and some of the questions, comments that came in from the chat gave us a lot of food for thought, and we look forward to collecting better and more relevant data in the future. And we will be building on these examples of data collection as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, hopefully on the other side as soon as possible, and consider how we can use some of these for our longer term responses for wider development, to make sure that we live up to our expectation and to be inclusive as possible and leave no one behind. And so it is particularly encouraging to know that we have such a great depth of knowledge in this area in our region, and both in academia as well as the civil society. So I hope that our team can maintain contact with all of you in moving forward, so that we can really work as partners. And I would like to finally encourage everybody listening to this webinar to log on to the next one, which is the Inter-American Development Bank's IDAHOTB celebration on Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I think that's the US Eastern Standard Time. So until I see you again next year, hopefully not through the web, face to face on the other side of the pandemic. And until then, stay safe, and thank you all once again, and take care and stay healthy. Bye-bye.